Chapter 17, Going Deep into History. The account told me by Anastasia's grandfather struck me as being quite extraordinary, and yet quite simple in its proof of the extraordinary. Subsequently, I began comparing his arguments with those from other sources, and was amazed at how closely the details coincided. These were facts which nudged logical thinking to certain conclusions, and now I shall try reconciling the conclusions drawn by Anastasia's grandfather with those of other sources. Back during the years 30 to 100 of our Common Era, small groups of believing Jews and dissidents living in Israel, Palestine, or other parts of the Roman Empire began to merge into an independent movement within Judaism. This resulted in the formation of a small Christian community comprising people who earnestly believed in the precepts of Christ Jesus and his imminent resurrection. An account attested in a great number of historical monographs, including the Bible. In a word, there is no question that the mighty Christian doctrine began with the gatherings of a small Jewish community. But now let us try to determine how the teachings of this small community suddenly found its way into not only the Roman Empire, but also the territories of present-day Europe and Russia. How did people in so many countries come to hear of it, given that so few people knew about it, even in Israel itself? According to Anastasia's grandfather, the priests who controlled the Jews of that period realized that by tinkering with, or rather reworking, the Christian teachings in a certain way, these teachings could shape a type of slave mentality, which would be very easy to control. This mentality, either partially or almost completely, rules out independent logical thinking. A man begins to believe what he is told by the clergy or by someone else. More precisely, one ends up with bio-robotic people, subject to whatever programming has been instilled in them. A bio-robotic man is a man who consents, not entirely of his own free will, of course, but under the influence of special occult programming, to believe in an unreal world. And given that this unreal world has been constructed by someone for a specific purpose, this someone claims that he knows the laws of the unreal world and demands that man subject himself to them, whereas in fact he is subjecting the man personally to himself. Next, the priests of Judaism, who at the time had not just the knowledge but also the practical experience of inculcating self-serving teachers into masses of people, trained hundreds of preachers from Christian ranks, gave them money and sent them off to various countries to instill the priests' own self-serving teachings into the local populations. An incidental proof of this may be seen in the following. At the end of the 2nd century of our Common Era, a number of Jewish Christian communities suddenly launched a comprehensive missionary campaign in various countries. This campaign was preceded by a period of intensified evangelization, the publication and copying of the Christian Hebrew Bible. Everybody knows perfectly well that even today, publishing books requires money. In ancient times, the production of each book required not just money, but big money. A goodly sum would have been needed too for travel to other countries. It was largely merchants or wealthy and prominent people who could afford such travel. So how could such an extravagant large-scale operation be carried out by a community consisting mainly of rural residents? Of course, there must have been expert theoretical training and a considerable amount of financing involved. The attention the priests paid to these rural residents, together with their moral and financial support, served to turn ordinary peasant believers into fully fledged fanatics. Just picture to yourself a Hebrew villager who is suddenly told, "We see in you the makings of a great missionary and preacher. All you have to do is study up a bit, we'll give you money, and you'll teach people, only not here in our country, you'll be going to other countries." And so they studied up, got the money, and off they went, travelling to other lands. So what was the result? Any success? Not a bit. The Jewish preachers were rejected by the people in every country they went to. It was more than just a simple rejection. At first they were listened to, then asked to leave, The more obtrusive among them were beaten or had dogs set upon them. This is confirmed by many historical facts known from the Roman Empire of the period, where the major contingent of preachers was sent. The only significant result of this massive campaign was the organising of a network of Christian communities in various parts of the Roman Empire. But there was no way they could shake the foundations of the traditional sects of the time. Ancient Rome was left just as pagan as in earlier times. These sects exerted no influence either on the political life of the empire or on the formation of the new type of man, the bio-robotic slaves the priests had dreamt about. And the Roman emperors had absolutely no regard for this first wave of preachers. The Emperor Nero, who was generally tolerant of the various pagan beliefs on the whole, took a particular dislike to the Christians. Christians were expelled from Roman territory by various emperors. Dionysius, 249-251, Diocletes, 284-285, and especially Galerius, 305-311, one of the leading persecutors of the sect. It was not until the second wave came that the preachers had any success. Unlike their predecessors, preachers of the second wave were no fanatics. The priests prepared them in such a way that they could speak eloquently about their faith on the one hand, while on the other they had a knowledge of psychology and were capable of influencing a person by using his aspirations to achieve their own ends. The mission of the second wave of preachers was focused solely on the rulers, persuading them that their authority could be enhanced and perpetuated by the Christian faith, that it would make their state completely governable, controllable, and flourishing. It was to this end that certain dogmas were introduced as well, such as all power is of God, and the ruler is God's vicegerent on the earth. Confessions opened the door to controlling the thoughts, hopes, and actions of every citizen of a country. In a word, the preachers began persuading the rulers of the Christianization of a state would create the most favourable conditions for governing. And on the surface it did, but only on the surface. In falling into these traps, the rulers had no idea they were actually falling under the control of other powers. Christianity began noticeably consolidating its position in the Roman Empire, beginning in 312 CE, when Emperor Constantine was persuaded how advantageous the presence of Christian churches within the state would be for him. He agreed to offer them patronage, even while still maintaining the temples to the Roman gods. This led to a significant improvement in the position of Christianity within the Roman Empire, an increase in its wealth and successive generations of Christian archbishops, attaining a level of power rivaling that of the Roman senators. This phenomenon, along with many others to follow, attests to the fact that Christian teachings were unable to develop and exert any serious influence on society without the support of secular rulers. Christian leaders themselves were always among the pretenders to power. While the Roman Church continues to enjoy great power even today, the Roman Empire disappeared. A coincidence? An exception to the rule, or a predictable pattern? This question can be answered by examining the history of nation-states in the ensuing centuries, right up to the present day. There is not a single state on our planet anybody could name which began flourishing with the arrival of Christianity. On the other hand, one can name off a whole list of states which succumbed to the same sad fate as the Roman Empire. And one more interesting historical fact. In every single country where Christianity was officially adopted, it wasn't long before non-Christian Jews began to appear and start engaging in rather strange activities. They became wealthy with extraordinary ease. In every Christian country, they pursued their activities on such a large scale that they could help but be noticed, that they couldn't help but be noticed by both the citizenry and the governments of these countries. And when they reached a certain level in a particular land, the people started reacting violently toward them, and the government began expelling them abroad. We have access to a whole lot of reports of anti-Jewish pogroms in various Christian countries, dating back to the beginning of the 11th century. In 1096, dozens of Jewish communities were plundered into the Rhine and their residents exiled. In 1290, Jews were expelled from England. At the end of the 14th century, more than 100,000 Jews were exterminated in Spain. Granted, sometime later, Jews quietly began coming back from these countries. This list of historical facts could all too easily be added to, but no need. It is already absolutely clear that these situations, so similar to each other and constantly repeating themselves over many centuries, are the result of pre-programming. And since losses have been suffered by both the members of the Christian world and the Jews themselves, there must be a third party involved which remains free from loss. For this third party, both types of man, the Christian and the Jew, are reduced to the status of mere biorobots, easily manipulable. Who is this third party? Historical researchers attempting to dig out the roots and discover the essence of the lawlessness that has been taking place constantly in the world over the millennia have always pointed only to the Jews. They are to blame for everything, or so the claim goes. But if there exists a third power, both the Jews and the Christians turn out to be nothing but puppet biorobots in the hands of this third power. But is it possible to determine and prove its existence today? Is it possible? Of course it is. By what means? By means of historical facts and logical thinking. You can judge for yourselves. Within the Jewish society, there is one tribe in particular, or layer, ethnic division, caste. You can call it what you like. The name doesn't really matter. For brevity's sake, let's call them Levites. Some historical sources say the Levites were descendants of the Egyptian priests. Other more familiar sources, in particular the Old Testament, give us to understand that the Levites occupied a special position among the Jews. For example, according to Hebrew law, they were exempt from participation in military action. They were not compelled to pay taxes or tributes to anyone. The Levites were not included in the Hebrew census described in the Old Testament. When the Hebrews were on the march and the time came to make camps of Israel, numbering anywhere from 50,000 to 150,000, their tents in a circle, each one in a pre-designated spot. Of the north, south, east and west coordinates, as well as the locations where guards were to be. The Levites invariably occupied the centre. Hence protectionites fell within the duties of all the other Hebrew tribes. And just what of this class of Levites do? It was their duty to appoint from among their ranks to conduct services, to enforce Jewish laws which regulated what to eat, what to do with apostates, and where to go. The laws were strict and specific. They covered all one's waking hours from morning till night. They showed what lands people could occupy, also whom they should fight. Thus, the Levites were the de facto rulers of the Jewish people, and all things considered, most definitely qualified for the job. It is hard to tell whether the Levites were actually Jews themselves. Few of the laws every Jew was supposed to abide by extended to them. For example, while universal Jewish law required circumcision of a child on the 8th day after birth, the Levites were exempt. Thus, with their knowledge of the secret science of the Egyptian priests and their capacity to do experiments, engage in observation and contemplation free from military duties and the work routine everybody else was so accustomed to, They have been in a position to constantly perfect their knowledge from generation to generation right up to the present day. Now, how could that be up to the present day? People may wonder why we haven't heard about the ethnic group or social class known as the Levites. The English, Russians, and French, for example, everybody knows about them. But why do so few people know about the most intelligent people of all, the Levites, especially since they are the ones governing everybody? The reason is that just like the Egyptian priests, they too must remain in the shadows. In case anything happens, full responsibility will fall on the Jews, the ones who carry out their will. Jews have been persecuted for centuries in various countries of the world. Persecuted for what? For using any means they can to make as much money as possible, and many of them are successful. Anyway, what have the Levites got to do with this? What benefit or interest would it be to them if Jews in England, Spain or Russia went about their politicking and transferred a major part of public or private funds to their own bank accounts? In other words, pocket the money for themselves. Wouldn't both the rulers and the people of some country or other catch sight of this ugly phenomenon and start a violent reaction against Jews and mistreat them? Something like that could go all the way up to the Levites. Hence the impression of illogicality in the action of the wise Levites. And what point would there be in the Levites helping the Jews with sound advice or in coming up with clever intrigues for them, manipulating whole nation states at a time? Well, as it turns out, there is a point. A matter of simple, direct and specific interest: money. Wealthy Jews, no matter what country they find themselves in, are obliged to pay a part of their profits to the Levites. Proof? Take a look. According to the Old Testament, the Hebrews are obliged to give a 10th part of their income to the Levites. Here is the exact wording from the Bible. All the contributions from holy gifts which the Israelites set aside for the Lord, I give to you and to your sons and daughters with you as a Jew in perpetuity. This is a perpetual covenant of salt before the Lord with you and your descendants also. The Lord said to Aaron, you shall have no patrimony in the land of Israel, no holding among them. I am your holding in Israel. I am your patrimony. To the Levites I give every tithe in Israel to be their patrimony, in return for the service they render in maintaining the tent of the presence, in order that the Israelites may not henceforth approach the tent and thus incur the penalty of death. The Levites alone shall perform the service of the tent, and they shall accept the full responsibility for it. This rule is binding on your descendants for all time. They shall have no patrimony among the Israelites, because I give them as their patrimony the tithe which the Israelites set aside as a contribution to the Lord. Therefore I say unto them, you shall have no patrimony among the Israelites. The Lord spoke to Moses and said, Speak to the Levites in these words. When you receive from the Israelites the tithe which I give you from them as your patrimony, you shall set aside from it the contributions to the Lord, a tithe of the tithe. Your contribution shall count for you as if it were corn from the threshing floor and juice from the vat. In this way you too shall set aside the contribution due to the Lord out of all tithes which you receive from the Israelites, and shall give the Lord's contribution to Aaron the priest. Out of all the gifts you receive you shall set aside the contribution given due to the Lord, and the gift which you hallow must be taken from the choicest of them. You shall say to the Levites, when you have set aside the choicest part of your portion, the remainder shall count for you as the produce of the threshing floor and the winepress, and you may eat it anywhere, you and your sons and your households. It is your payment for service in the tent of the presence. Someone might wonder how the Old Testament, more than 2,000 years old, relates to our modern times. There is an answer. Aren't there still rabbis and other clerics among Jewish believers today? Of course there are. And of course, the majority of Jews still observe their religious canons. If that is so, then just try to picture the colossal amount of capital held by the Levites, scattered through the banks of various countries. Besides that, they don't have to worry about maintaining or multiplying their capital. Most bankers in a lot of countries are Jews, and that is their job. Of course, at the right moment, the Levites can drop a hint as to where their capital should be invested. They can suggest which regimes, alliances, or groups supposing existing governments should be either supported or, alternatively, exterminated by financial intrigue. There might have been reason to doubt Anastasia's information on human society all over the globe being controlled by just a handful of priests. But now, after going through this chain of logic, there can no longer be any doubt for anyone still capable of logical thinking. I'm not talking about fanatics. The logic may be outlined as follows. Approximately 1 million Jews came out of Egypt under the control of the priests. The priests' close assistants were the Levites, to whom they entrusted the task of shaping the Jews into a predetermined type of individual man. To this end, they created an ideological religion, which set up a series of rituals along with a unique way of life. The Levites managed to carry out their appointed task. The ideology created several thousand years ago still weighs on the Jews even today. It is what distinguishes them from the host of other nationalities living on the earth. One of the basic tenets of this ideology is the declaration that, of all the national groups populating the earth, God selected the Jews alone as his chosen people. So, this ideology still exists today. The Jews still exist today. And the conflicts continue, and many people know about them. But where are the Levites? Do we ever hear much about them? Hardly at all. And therein lies their subtlety, or their wisdom. You can call it what you like, but they exist. Now picture to yourself a rather small group of people living on the earth who possess a greater degree of esoteric knowledge than anyone else. A group that has, over the millennia, been constantly adding to their experience of practical influence over masses of humanity. Is there anybody that can be compared with them? Say, some sort of state-sponsored institute set up to study issues of national development or the formation of ideologies? This is not possible for a variety of reasons, including the following. The Levites have been passing their esoteric knowledge down to their heirs for over the generations and are continuing to do so today. Modern science rejects esoteric knowledge and therefore does not consider it a serious object for research, to say the least. This absurd situation does not come about haphazardly, but why is it absurd? Judge for yourselves. On the one hand, the state accords official recognition to a number of religions, and they too are quite esoteric. The state even sets up favourable conditions for their financial support, yet the state does not make any provision for scientific study of esoteric tendencies. This means, in effect, that within the territory of the state, there are legalised structures capable of influencing the mentality of its citizenry. But the secular government has only the foggiest idea of what this influence consists of in actual practice. So in the end, who is controlling whom? Secondly, not only the government, but all its thinking citizens should try to learn the lessons of history. History makes a very good school of life. But for this, one has to know one's history. Those who rule the world know it perfectly well. Most people, however, and that includes those in the government, know next to nothing of the history of the state in which they live. More than that, the little history they do know is distorted. Russia is a perfect example. It wasn't that long before we heard in our schools and colleges, in art and especially literature, just about everywhere in fact, how terrible life was for our grandmothers and grandfathers of Tsarist Russia. For most of us, this belief was the sacred cow. For most of us, it went far beyond a belief. people made such a fuss over those that delivered us from the terror of Tsarism. For many people, the commissars in their leather jackets were heroes, while a symbol of reactionary extremism became the priesthood. And then, all at once, before our very eyes, no, not over 2 or 3 generations or centuries, but right before our eyes, history changed. The commissars in their leather jackets, it turned out, were scoundrels subjecting the people to genocide. And after Tsarism, we lived in the most terrible and totalitarian state in the world. And again, the majority of the people believed it. And once more, the majority made a fuss over those who had delivered them from the yoke of a totalitarian state. I'm not about to say which of these regimes is the better or the worse, but it seems that we should all ponder this phenomenon of change, something amounting to a whole sea change in our consciousness over an extremely brief period of time. We should ponder the question of why it changed so radically. Did the changes take place all by themselves or under somebody's manipulation? Here too it is not difficult to guess. For a long time now, it has been all too easy to manipulate our consciousness, and this is what is still going on today. We are like guinea pigs in somebody's hands. It is only the masters of manipulation that are competing among themselves. It is they who render us incapable of perceiving historical reality. But let us try to discern just what this reality, in fact, is all about. Let us try to determine historical reality, not on the basis of somebody's words, but of our own power of reasoning. Note how every day on the TV, programme after programme, keeps showing us firsthand how husbands subtly betray their wives and vice versa. We are constantly being called upon to pay attention to scores of non-existent problems. But, God forbid, any serious issue will be raised by our politicians, journalists or writers. Such an issue makes a brief appearance only to be immediately lost in the daily soup of gossip, violent TV series, psychotropic advertising and mudslinging. What we need is a thoughtful analysis of what's been going on, a critical analysis of the state of life on our planet today, and the working out of a plan for the future. We need a new ideology, an ideology that won't cause the world's peoples to come to blows with each other, but will actually unite them. But repeating 1,000 times how necessary it is to do this, even shouting it 1,000 times, won't make it happen. Even if we were to gather all the leading scholars of the world and sit them down together to work out this new ideology, again, nothing would come of it. Only an unending argument. If science were capable of working out such an ideology, it would have come up with it and put it into practice long ago, at least in some country or other. Anastasia, it doesn't matter anymore who she is, that's not the point. In the face of this ongoing lawlessness, Anastasia has given to the world the idea of family domains. Now it is becoming abundantly clear that in very simple terms she has outlined a philosophy, a new ideology, which has remained and still remains unshaken in human hearts ever since the creation of the world. Kings and paupers, Christians and Jews, Muslims and Shintoists, Russians, Chinese and Americans have always found the greatest grace and solace for their souls in the bosom of divine nature. Anastasia's philosophy is the philosophy of uniting mankind, not with words, but through concrete action, by merging the interests of different peoples of the world. Experience has shown that it is accepted by people of different nationalities, including Jews, and I have documented proof of this. And I invite Jewish analysts, Christians and ideologies of patriotic movements to examine her ideas and philosophical aspirations. My invitation extends to leaders and followers of any religious denomination, either large or small. The very act of examination is a creative process in itself, which can lead to a union of opposites, to a conjoint creation and joy for all from its contemplation.
As God himself wanted. End of chapter 17.
Chapter 18. Take down Jesus Christ from the cross. I'll say this right off. One must be careful not to confuse the teachings of Jesus Christ, the selfless deeds of Russian church elders, with the occult set of rituals we are confronted with today. It is quite possible for the most beautiful teachings to be neutralized by occult devices. As you must realize yourself, Christ Jesus has nothing to do with them. Moreover, he himself continues to hang on the cross to this day, thanks to the efforts of the occultists and our own ignorance. I have deliberately devoted a number of chapters to the power of the energy of human thought, through which people are able to create images. If this is understandable, then tell me, which is the clearest image of Jesus Christ prevailing in your thought, in the thoughts of the majority of believers? A straw poll points to a crucifix, the image of Christ Jesus crucified on the cross. You will find crucifixes in every Catholic and Orthodox church. Who thought up an occult device like this, and for what purpose? Did Christ Jesus himself want this particular image to be front and centre, predominating over all the others? Of course not. But we, yes we, continue to project the image of the crucifixion. No, not the resurrection, but the crucifixion, through the power of our own thoughts. And the image we kiss is not of the resurrection, but of the crucifixion. And that is how we still keep him on the cross. This simple occult device uses the energy of collective human thought in shaping an image. And Jesus Christ will remain hanging on the cross until we realize this and take him down from it with our thoughts, until we stop giving in to an occult machinations. Right from the start, in shaping the various religions, the priests tried to imbue them with their occult rituals and teachings. Any religion, even the very brightest, one which summons people to kindness and noble deeds, if interwoven with the priest's nuances, can be a powerful device in their hands. This device has enabled them to subjugate whole entire nations and set them at odds with each other, to the point of utter self-annihilation. That's the way it has been and still is today. Many contemporary religions still today involve occult rituals and teachings whose meaning and degree of influence on mankind is known only to the priests. The projection of Jesus Christ's crucifixion by a great many people's thoughts is due to a particular occult ritual, but the people themselves involved in this projection, or rather their souls, will be crucified over and over again as long as they project this image. The collective thought of the crucifixion is so strong that it can penetrate right through to the flesh of people today. Jesus' bleeding wounds periodically appear on the bodies of certain believers. This is known as the stigmata mystery. Many scholars believe that the stigmata, or bleeding wounds, are a symptom of mental illness. I would add that this is not a disease affecting a single individual, but rather a whole segment of society, and that its root cause is an occult ritual observance induced by the priests. However, instead of making a thorough investigation of this phenomenon, such enterprising people have exploited it for commercial purposes. Take, for example, the city of San Nicolas in Argentina, home of the stigmatic Gladys Motta. All around her house are signs of a brisk trade in everything directly or indirectly connected to her. Anastasia's grandfather put it this way: people murdering each other, along with what you call terrorism, is rooted in the teachings of the priests, which they have infused into many religious denominations, both large and small. They are the ones who came up with the doctrine that man's true divine life is not on the earth, but somewhere in another dimension. They are the ones who invented the image of a paradise apart from the earth God himself created. It is because of this doctrine that so many religious fanatics manifest an attitude of neglect toward life on the earth. It takes but a small amount of pressure exerted on their mind to induce them to kill either themselves or others. Anastasia has tried to bring this information to our attention through many different words and phrases, but not everybody will grasp what she says. Not everyone will understand my words. You, Vladimir, along with your readers, should give careful thought to what we have said, and cite your own examples and proofs. A number of different voices blending into a single whole will be able to bring liberation. Look carefully at the root cause of war and terrorism today, and you will clearly see the influence of this monstrous teaching. The Siberian elder went on at some length on this subject. He appeared to be just a little excited, sometimes pausing to stroke the cedar pendant hanging around his neck, before returning to the topic of how we ourselves need to be more aware of the manifestation of occult rituals and teachings. No spiritual teachers will be able to save people from these doctrines if the people don't start thinking for themselves and learning to recognize them, Grandfather said. Believing that I had grasped the significance of this statement, I set about investigating the phenomenon of terrorism in our lives. In the future, this is something we shall have to do all together. I shall merely start the ball rolling. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19. Terrorism. And so, in recent years, a wave of acts of terrorism has swept across many lands. Memories of large-scale events, such as those of 11th of September 2001 in America, still haunt people's minds. A fearful terrorist act took place even more recently in our country. From the 23rd to the 26th of October 2002, terrorists held more than 800 people hostage at the Moscow Theatre Centre in Dubrovka Street during a performance of the musical Nord-Ost. In between these two major acts of terrorism, quite a few others have occurred, not quite so spectacular in various parts of the globe, claiming human lives. On each occasion, different governments have angrily denounced the terrorists involved. Their special services keep mouthing assurances that the guilty parties will be punished, at the same time increasing the level of precautionary security measures. An international coalition to combat terrorism is already at work. Even today, however, the problem shows no signs of letting up. Quite to the contrary, it is taking on even greater proportions and becoming increasingly refined in its methods. It is hard to escape the impression that someone has been making masterful ploys to keep leading both governments and their special services down the wrong path. The true source and chief organizer of many of the world's terrorist acts came in for a brief mention not too long ago in Russia. During the October 2002 hostage crisis, the major TV networks featured a whole host of interviews and commentaries. This included statements from the Emergency Response Headquarters, presented by the Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs, among others. This trim, grey-haired man spoke tersely, almost in military fashion. His speech included no hesitation sounds like His sentences were marked by thoughtful content and sensitivity, indicating that his thinking was relatively quick and precise. He was one of the first to declare that we're dealing here with religious fanatics. Quite possibly, not very many people paid attention to this particular phrase, but for many who did understand, it resounded like a bolt from the blue. For the very first time, from the lips of a Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs yet, one of the fundamental tenets of terrorism was called by its real name. This was followed by the floating of another concept, Islamic fundamentalism. Rumours began circulating that Islamic fundamentalists had declared war on Christians and Jews, Israel, Russia, and the United States of America in particular. The question arises as to how to fight against religious fanaticism. I suggest we all calm down and take a more thoughtful look at the situation. Let us first decide whether religious fanaticism is found only in Islam, or whether it exists in other religions as well. Of course the latter is true. Let's not forget history. Think of the numerous Christian crusades. Think of the painting of the Boyarinya Morozova. Think of the names of all the martyrs ready to sacrifice their lives in the sake of some religious dogma. Martyrs who are elevated to sainthood after death. The fact becomes patently obvious that it is not religion as a whole, but rather specific dogmas infused into various religions which makes people indifferent to their own life. The religious suicide fanatic is quite confident that, far from being indifferent to life, he is crossing over into real life. How does this happen? Among any community of believers, Muslim or Christian, there can always be found a group of radical adherents to a particular dogma, whose faith can be honed by occult rituals to the point of fanaticism. The result is a kind of biorobot who believes in something he himself can't see or understand logically. Subsequently, those who are familiar with the functioning of the mind know perfectly well what buttons to press on this biorobot, and they press them. Not with their fingers, of course, they simply indicate the target the biorobot is to destroy for the sake of a bright future. Then the biorobots begin to work out the termination operation on their own and proceed to carry it out. Their own earthly life no longer has any meaning for them. They are, after all, confident in their own transition to a better heavenly existence. And so long as there exists the doctrine of goodness being attainable not on the earth but somewhere else, no army or special services will succeed in eliminating suicide bombers. Let us picture the following situation. Let's say the special services belonging to the major powers have got together and, through their joint efforts, have managed to get rid of every last terrorist on the globe. But what will that change? New terrorists will simply be born, as long as the doctrine which produces them continues to exist. So what is the solution? Of course, one cannot do without traditional precautionary measures, but along with these it is essential to understand how dangerous the doctrine is and to eliminate it before it produces more and more suicide bombers. Understanding that is the most important thing today. Otherwise, the struggle against terrorism will simply turn out to be a joke. Picture the following situation. A religious fanatic, a suicide bomber, seizes an aeroplane and aims it at some significant target in a major populated area. The authorities start negotiating with the terrorist. They tell him they are ready to meet any demands he has. But what these negotiators do not realise is that the religious fanatic's real goal is not the satisfaction of his demands. His aim is to die and assure himself entry into the non-earthly paradise he's imagined for himself. This dogma of a non-earthly paradise, projected by the collective thought of people of various denominations, influences unbelievers too. For millennia now it has been exerting a most destructive influence on all mankind. What I'm about to tell you now may seem unrealistic, even fantasical. Still, the only way to solve this problem without violence may be the following. It is absolutely essential that Orthodox Church patriarchs, Islamic muftis, religious elders, and above all Christians, Catholics, and Muslims come together for a conference to carefully examine the situation in the world today and change the life-destroying doctrines in their religious teachings. It is essential that religious fanatics be helped to regain their human perspective on life. It is essential to declare, our Father is here on the earth and not somewhere else. And what if the religious leaders don't get together? What if they don't make any declaration like that? Not to worry, it has already been made. People aren't turned on anymore by the leaders of our religious denominations exhorting everyone to live in peace and friendship with each other. Just the mere statement that we will have nothing to do with terrorism is no longer believable. A more radical step is required. I indicated that a meeting and declaration such as this may be dismissed as unrealistic. Let's examine why. Why are we reluctant to believe that highly placed, highly religious leaders would not be able to simply come to an agreement amongst themselves? After all, if they can't come to an agreement, then what can you expect from rank and file believers? If they can't come to an agreement on their own, then common sense elements in society and governments need to give them some help. It's absolutely essential that we talk amongst themselves and agree. Otherwise, bombs will start talking for them in a big way. Much better for the mind of man to do the talking, the mind of the children of God. At first glance, it may seem as though it might take a rather long time for Anastasia's ideas to effect any positive transformation in Russia, let alone other countries, seeing how gradually human consciousness ordinarily changes. However, experience has shown that in the case of many readers, it can change instantaneously. Let's look at what might happen in Chechnya if the Russian government, the State Duma, had adopted a law granting every willing family a hectare of land on which to establish a domain of their own along the lines recommended by Anastasia. The 20,000 refugees who have been living with their families in tents for 3 years now would have been granted their own domains. Over those 3 years, each of those same tents, which are now forming dirty tent cities, would already be standing in its own splendid garden. Some of the residents would have already managed to build themselves a house. Who is stopping this from coming about today? Somebody who favours not peace, but its opposite. Somebody who is trying to prevent any positive changes from taking place in Russia. Your efforts are wasted, chaps. I doubt any of you has even the foggiest idea of just who Anastasia is or what powers she embodies within herself. I'll say one thing. It's not simply that she will create what she has thought up. She has already created it. It's already coming to pass, and your opposition confirms it. Any building site has its share of garbage, but sooner or later they clean it up and plant flowers. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20. Pagans. The main criticism levelled against Anastasia comes down to the allegation that she is a pagan, without even the slightest proof or examination of the ideas put forward by this Tega recluse. Though Anastasia herself clearly and distinctly called herself Vedrus. Well then, if she is a pagan, what does that imply? Japan, even today, is practically a pagan country. The Roman Empire, in its heyday, was pagan too. Our forefathers and mothers were also pagan. But much more than that. By the time when the Egyptian state and the Roman Empire were flourishing, Vedic culture was still reigning in Russia. So, should we be proud of our pagan history and heritage, or be ashamed of it? We are told that our heritage is something to be ashamed of. The words paganism and pagan have been turned into word symbols designating something bad or terrible. The word Christian has also become a word symbol, but it symbolises, by contrast, spirituality, decency, enlightened thought, closeness to God. Today we have the opportunity to observe the Christian as a type and judge his worth by his fruits. We can judge by our own modern way of life. What am I saying? We are not in a position to judge anything. We simply can't compare this type with the way of life led by our pagan forefathers and mothers, which people today are all too prone to curse, hidden as it is from our sight. In sum, what we are told about the history of our country as served up to us is the following. Our ancestors were some kind of dark, horrible people, but then enlighteners arrived, bringing with them a new ideology worked out in Israel, namely Christianity. The Russian Prince Vladimir adopted it and baptized the whole nation of Rus. Not long ago, we celebrated the millennium of this event. But what is 1,000 years? A mere split second against the backdrop of billions of years. Well, let's think in terms of Not a split second, but a single day. That's very important. Being able to compress time. Now you will see what comes from this line of reasoning. Let's say you awake one fine sunny morning and see visitors at your door. They proceed to tell you that your parents are bad and horrible pagans, that you must become Christian, and instead of communing with nature, you must ask forgiveness for your sins, since your parents are such sinners that their sins have attached themselves to you. And right off you agree with the foreigner's statements. You follow them to the temple and kiss the hands. You ask for their blessing and try not even to think about your parents. You try to erase them from your memory, leaving behind nothing but the notion horrible pagans. This is the picture that emerges from our figurative compression of time. Over the past 1,000 years, the foreigners have focused our attention on a multitude of different events. They tell about who went to war with whom, what splendid buildings they constructed, who married whom among the princes or kings, who gained power and how. But by comparison with one's attitude towards one's parents and their culture, this has no essential significance. All these other events, disasters and woes will simply be a consequence of the fundamental act of betraying one's parents. But we never betrayed our parents, someone will argue. Such events took place more than 1,000 years ago, and those were quite different people who lived back then. Well, I could paraphrase it and expand the time frame, but it wouldn't make a scrap of difference. Your distant, very distant, foremother was a pagan. She loved and understood nature. She was acquainted with the universe and knew the meaning of the rising sun. She gave birth to you. She gave birth to you in the far distant past, in a marvellous garden, and your beautiful foremother rejoiced over you, and your father was happy at your appearance. And your forefather and foremother wanted you, so far, far distant from your present-day self, to make this marvellous space even more marvellous. To make it so that it would come down to you in the present day, enhanced by each succeeding generation, so that you, today, would be able to live on the earth, transformed into a planet of divine paradise. They did this especially for you. They were pagans, and were able to understand God's thoughts through nature. Your distant, very distant Mama and Papa knew how to make you happy. They knew because they were pagans. Your father died in an unequal battle with foreign mercenaries, fighting for your future. Your Mama was burnt at the stake because she refused to exchange your marvellous future for what you see around you today. But today still came, and today the descendants of the pagans are still on bended knee, still kissing the hands of the descendants of those who burnt their mothers and slew their fathers. They kiss their hands and make up songs about Russia's inconquerability. They sing songs about the Russian spirit, slavishly crawling on their knees for more than a millennium now. What kind of freedom is that? Hey, you who have been oppressed by a 1,000-year yoke, intoxicated by the drug and foreign ideology, it's time to wake up. Whoever is able, wake up and start thinking. How could it have happened that Anastasia, a Siberian recluse, a Russian, after saying only a few words about Russian history, was immediately met by such opposition, and not just anywhere, but right here in Russia itself? If this country, as we believe, was not seized by ideologues from abroad, then who is behind all this opposition? It turns out that it is the Russians themselves who are opposing even the slightest mention of their past, of their parents, as though they, Russians, had quite lost their marbles. No, not quite, and this is evident from the multitude of letters, songs and verses, the constantly increasing print runs, already totaling millions of copies, of books containing the sayings of Anastasia. The hearts of Russians are starting to beat in time with the hearts of their forebears, both distant and not so distant, who dreamt about their children's happiness. The opposition is being provoked by mercenaries and their accomplices. What kind of mercenaries? What kind of mercenaries accomplices? Can you seriously think that the transformation of the whole Russian people's way of life was brought about simply by the word of some Russian prince named Vladimir, especially in view of his rather shaky hold on his princely throne? What, did he just happen to be sitting around one day and say, "Well, lads, I've decided you're all going to have to forget your parents' culture and be converted to Christianity"? And the people enthusiastically replied, "Sure, we're tired of our ancestors' culture. Come on, Prince, baptize us." Absurd? Of course it's absurd. In actual fact, Prince Vladimir first tried to strengthen his hold on power through changing the religious views of his ancient Slavs, setting up a pantheon of pagan deities. Pagan belief, however, would not permit the hallowing of the social relations that would result. It rejected the attempted justification of social and propriety inequality, man's exploitation of his fellow man, and the divine right of kings. Hence, Prince Vladimir, in order to satisfy his political ambitions, was obliged to select a foreign religion for the Russian people. But if you still wish to look upon... Oh no, I've missed out a page. It's no secret that the choice fell upon the Byzantine variant of Christianity, precisely because it allowed for the virtual subordination of the clergy to the prince's authority, never mind the legal question of subordination to the Patriarch of Constantinople. But we are assured that Vladimir took this step for the benefit of Rus's enlightenment and prosperity. We're all aware that a change of ideology is almost invariably accompanied by social disasters and bloodshed. But in this case, it wasn't merely a question of a change of ideology. It was a sharp sea change in religion, culture, way of life, and social order. Compared to the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, this was a revolution 70 times 7, and if it too had been followed by a bloody civil war, it would have been a civil war 70 times 7. But in those early times, there was no civil war. There was no civil war simply because pagan Russia was inhabited exclusively by pagans. We're told there was opposition, including armed opposition between pagan and Christian in Rus. But if Rus was wholly pagan, then where did the Christians come from? They came from other countries along with the mercenaries. Prince Vladimir, at the time, was a long way from being the most powerful prince in the region. Of course, he had his own armed garrison, but we learned from history that this garrison was far from being equal to any serious military confrontation. Additional support from the populace was always required. The basic armed forces in ancient Rus were always made up of the people's militia. But what kind of popular military resistance can we talk about if the people as a whole were opposed to baptism? Foreign mercenaries, perhaps? Of course. But was the prince's treasury wealthy enough to hire and maintain an entire army? Of course not, but the prince still obtained the required funds. From whom? From the patriarchs of Rome and other Christianized countries. These patriarchates had become fairly wealthy by that time, and so it happened 1,000 years ago that the half-Russian Prince Vladimir, in return for the boost to his power, allowed foreign emissaries to conduct their propaganda campaign along with their schemes and provocations, and in the long run to commit acts of violence against the Russian people. Rus turned out to be a tougher nut to crack than the Roman Empire, and not easily given to being influenced by propaganda. This resulted in the prince using mercenaries to reinforce his garrison, and again the mercenaries' help to get rid of a part of the rebellious population. My opponents may argue that this is only one version of events, No, my ideological friends, we are talking about objective historical reality. It can be proved even without the phenomenal abilities of Anastasia or her knowledge of history. I, as a simple human being, can prove it to you here and now, and that means a whole lot of other simple human beings will also be able to figure it out. Perhaps those devotees of occult ideologies can tell me how many millions of Russian fathers and mothers they burnt alive at the stake. Name your figure, even a conservative estimate will do. Or are you going to tell me that this never happened, but it did? Your own sources mention it. Think back. At a congress that took place in Russia back in the 15th century, a group of Volga elders raised the question of abolishing the death penalties for heretics. Note that this was already 5 centuries after the Christianization of Russia, and here are the sons of Rus still resisting. Not only was the death penalty not abolished, but the Volga elders faced an unenviable fate. But if you still wish to look upon what I have said as simply my version of events, go ahead. Only let us then regard your statements as a version too, and then let's compare both versions. A comparison will easily show that your version is completely illogical, that it is founded merely on statements which you demand to be accepted as truth. Besides, you are unable to present a single document confirming, for example, that pagans in Rus offered human sacrifices. Show people what archaeological evidence you have. Go dig up the victims. You won't find any because there weren't any. Show us the pagan books outlining their worldviews. Give people a chance to compare the cultures of both civilizations. You refuse to show them. Why? Because you know very well that once people become acquainted with such texts, they will see the utter absurdity of their modern lifestyle. And so, it turns out that your utopian version is not backed up by any proof, and so you demand that everyone simply believe, and that's it. Believe in us, or else you'll be labelled a godless non-believer. There is evidence to show that Rus was enslaved by deception and force. I shall not go through the whole list. A single example will suffice. From those times right up to the present day, Rus may be considered an enslaved country. Foreign ideology is still prevalent in the Rus of the present. Even today, Rus is still money, only in a different form. The flight of capital, the sale of resources, the stranglehold of poor quality foreign foods products on our market. Today, the ideological component is very closely monitored. Mention of the culture of ancient Rus is enough to call countermeasures into action, including the never-ending scheming and attacks on Anastasia. You speak of freedom of speech, but why are you so afraid of her words? Why do you try to discredit your own country's culture and not allow people to get to know it? I know why. The culture of our ancestors is marvellous, joyful, and highly spiritual. In my previous volume, called The Book of Kin, I cited Anastasia's account of a wedding rite involving 2 lovers. This rite still existed a scant 2,000 years ago in Rus. The publication of this book gave rise to a number of conclusions on the part of scholars and researchers. I've already mentioned that over the past while, Anastasia's sayings have been subjected to investigation by scholars in various disciplines. Some of them carry on their work openly and even try to have their findings published, while others simply send them in to the Anastasia Foundation for reference, so as not to leave them open to attack. I shall not name names, but simply convey the gist of their various reports. Anastasia's presentation of the wedding rite, prevalent in the culture of ancient Rus, is a unique and priceless document attesting to the high level of knowledge among the inhabitants of the time. The whole rite is based not on belief in the supernatural, but on the knowledge of that which we today term supernatural. The individual components of this rite may be seen even today among various peoples. But in the modern interpretation, these components are purely ritualistic, senseless, and deficient in nature, and consequently not up to the task of cementing the union of two people in love to the same degree of effectiveness as back when they were applied with full conscious awareness. In today's version of the rite, some of these components seem meaningless, grounded in a kind of superstition. At best, they fall into the category of so-called esoteric activities. Anastasia's description takes us from a misperception of the rite as a senseless act to an awareness of its pre-eminent rationality, and indicates not only knowledge but the ultimate height of spirituality among those generations of Slavs which came before us. A comparative analysis of today's wedding rites and the one described by Anastasia fosters the impression that today's rites are more characteristic of an undeveloped, primitive society, while those of ancient Rus belong to a civilization which is highly developed in every sense of the word. For example, among a number of peoples today, including Russians, there is a ritual activity of showering the newlywed couple with cereal grains. One of the mothers or grandmothers or relatives of the newlyweds scatters cereal grains in front of the couple on their way into their home and throws it over the couple themselves as a token of happiness for the future family. This kind of activity today is associated with superstition or esoterica. There is no other rational explanation for it. What sense is there in seeds of grain simply falling on the floor, asphalt, or pathway leading to the house where they will be immediately trampled on and crushed? The ritual described by Anastasia also includes a special act involving cereal grains, but here, right off, one can associate it with several distinct and clearly thought through rational purposes. All the wedding guests, relatives, friends, and acquaintances bring with them seeds from their best plants, and each one plants by his own hand the little seed which he has brought with him in the spot designated by the newlywed couple. In terms of material wealth, it is not simply betokened, but actually achieved in practice by the special art described. In just a brief space of time, an hour or two, the newlyweds have the makings of their future orchard, drawing upon the best fruit and berry plantings in the neighbourhood, as well as a vegetable garden and a green hedge wherein to frame their space. No less important is a second or psychological aspect of this special act. Many of us know about the improvement of one's mental state upon entering into natural surroundings. Such pleasant sensations are enhanced by contact, not with someone else's garden plantings, but with your very own. The strength of spirit and level of emotions you should feel upon entering a garden where every little tree, bush, and blade of grass was created as a gift for you directly by your parents, relatives, and friends is something we can only guess at, as it is doubtful that anyone living on the earth today is able to have such a space as this. And by all appearances, it was not just material prosperity, but more importantly, one's inner positive emotions resulting from such a special act that played a fundamental role therein. In current esoteric literature, a lot is said about the energy of Kundalini and chakras. The information presented basically focuses attention on the possibility of the existence of chakras. There is little doubt as to the existence of the energy of love or the energy of sexual attraction between men and women. The vast majority of people have experienced the effect of this energy on themselves. Neither the theoreticians of the past or our modern sciences have ever touched upon the possibility that man can actually control this. The rite described by Anastasia has shown for the first time man can control, transform, and maintain this energy. In actual fact, the young lovers materialize the love which has been bestowed upon them, or which has entered into them. With the help of this energy, they shape a visible and tangible space around them. They see to it that this great energy remains with them in perpetuity. Why was this possible for them, but not in our present reality? Let us compare the actions of two loving couples in the past and present. The average loving couple today spends their time either at entertainment venues or alone together on walks or at home. They often enter into sexual relations even before marriage. The basic goal of most lovers today is the official recognition of their relations by a secular marriage bureau or a church. Research has shown that young couples do not adequately plan for their future life together. If a couple should try to determine their course of life together after marriage, it is a vague conjecture at best. Psychologists observe that it is the hope of each would-be newlywed that after joining together, their life will be improved by their partner. They all hope that the elevated, life-fulfilling state of love will carry on after marriage, but the love is fleeting. The surrounding space becomes routine. Far from reminding them of their earlier feelings of being in love, it starts to become irritating through its routineness and primitiveness. The irritation can also arise in the couple's relationship to one another. Few suspect that something other than this irritation is at the root of the couple's actions after marriage. Dissatisfaction actually results from an inability to make proper use of the state of love. As practice has shown, neither secular laws nor religious admonitions are capable of ensuring continuing mutual affection or even an attitude of mutual respect. Now let us take a look at the actions of the young couple in the account presented by Anastasia and try to come up with a logical, scientific interpretation. First, the declaration of love in itself is quite striking. With you, my beautiful goddess, I could create a space of love to last forever, the young man told his intended, and if the girl's heart responded in kind, she might answer, My God, I am ready to help you in your grand co-creation. Now compare this with the declaration of love formulated by the famous poet, which comes to the closest to describing the gist of modern attitudes towards the energy of love. I love you so. What can I say more? What else can I tell you besides? As we can see, the first declaration above proposes right off a distinctly formulated grand act, namely the creation of a space of love. In effect, it is a scientific materialization of love. The second declaration, on the contrary, does nothing more than state, I love you, with no further action specified. It is simply that neither he nor she have any idea how and for what purpose to use their energy of love. The lovers in Anastasia's account, by mutual agreement, set about forming a space of love for themselves and their future generations. They go off by themselves and may even spend the night in a shelter they have built on their chosen plot of land, but refrain from entering into sexual relations. Is this some kind of ritualistic abstination? In such instances, abstention are part of many people's religious beliefs. They are also found in secular ethics. Young people in love should not enter into sexual relations before their marriage is registered, or, alternatively, before they are wedded in a religious ceremony. However, the vast majority of young people today pay no heed to religious admonitions or public condemnation, but freely launch into premarital sex. Why? The most probable answer lies in the complete illogicality of both their social and religious requirements, the lack of a plausible explanation as to what the energy of love is all about, or more accurately, simple ignorance thereof. The energy of love activates a whole complex of feelings in man. It accelerates the mental process And this energy can be compared with an apex of inspiration, which presupposes a series of grand acts to follow. Thanks to their knowledge, as well as a highly developed culture of mutual human relations, the young couples of ancient Rus quite naturally directed the energy of love and sexual attraction toward the act of creating a space for their future life together. What two young lovers create together can hardly be surpassed, one would imagine, with the help of scientific investigation. The following statement of Anastasia's attests to this. The world of academe is in no position to create even the similitude of a splendid domain, because, again, there is a law of the universe which says, a single creator, inspired by love, is stronger than all the sciences combined, which are deprived of love. All the actions of the participants in the events reflected in Anastasia's account of the wedding rite are infused by logic, rationality, and the highest degree of culture and spirituality. By comparison, what a sorry spectacle is offered by our modern wedding ceremonies, with the main focus on the reception, where the guests gorge themselves on food and alcohol. In terms of their emotional richness, along with their meaningful and informative content, Anastasia's presentation of the parables and rites of ancient pagan, or to use her term Vedic Rus, by far surpass all the ancient tales we know of describing our past history, even the famous song of Igor's campaign pales before them. Through her narratives on Vedic Rus, Anastasia is, in effect, revealing to us the highly spiritual culture of a civilization of which we were hitherto unaware. She is radically transforming academic concepts as to the history not only of our country, but of humanity as a whole. Such an unexpected sea change, not to mention the simplicity with which it was brought about, has thrown many leading lights into contemporary academia into confusion, and in an effort to somehow maintain the framework of the academic positions they have attained, they try to pretend that nothing has changed, that they know nothing about the information presented. They're like ostriches hiding their heads in the sand. The information is real, it is truly priceless and sensational, and it will come to be demanded more and more by society at large. I have presented to you, dear readers, the pronouncements of a number of academics, researchers. As you can see, they confirm the informational significance of Anastasia's sayings, and even talk about the subsequent confusion among contemporary scholars. But confusion is one thing. The opposition, the concentrated efforts being made to stop the spread of this information, which sheds light on the history of our country and our people, is quite another. Somebody has felt very threatened by the possibility of our digging into the knowledge and culture of our forebears. Who might that be? Under whose influence are they operating today? These people that are calling our ancestors barbaric pagans, perverting that great word pagan to suggest something backward or evil, what program are they following? And how come our historians have accepted such a definition? It couldn't have been our historians that did that. Maybe they're not historians at all. If they haven't been able to tell us up to now anything concrete about the history of our country of just 1,000 years ago, but keep on insulting or tacitly allowing others to insult this period of our history, then these are not historians of Russia, but traitors or mercenaries acting on behalf of somebody else. And we shouldn't be relying upon them any longer. It is vital that we ourselves, through our joint efforts, bit by bit, use analogies to restore our own past and rehabilitate both our forebears and ourselves. If we don't, many readers of the Ringing Cedars series have already begun to write a book of kin for their children. Some of them will certainly want to express their thoughts of the history of ancient Rus, to tell their children about where we came from. But what can we write about our past? Are we really going to carry on with that nonsense we have been told for so long? Maybe it's better not to write anything about our past, just pretend it never existed. But that won't work. If we act that way, then our children after us will keep getting served up the same story over and over again in a way that will suit somebody's particular interests. Someone may wonder how we, as ordinary folk, not scholarly historians, can restore a history of 2,000 or 3,000 years. We can, since we'll be doing it not because we're carrying out someone's instructions, but according to the dictates of our hearts and minds. I shall attempt to start the ball rolling, but let us all together begin gathering whatever stories, facts and analogies we can, and putting together our own family histories. Let us all begin thinking and reasoning about this together. As I said, a lot can be restored, even just adding analogy. Here's an example, take a look. More than 2,000 years ago, the mighty Roman Empire was in its heyday, including Roman law, the Roman Senate, and Roman emperors. The cities of the empire were adorned with epochal edifices, and Rome already had a water supply system. There were libraries and a flourishing of art. The Roman Empire waged quite a number of wars. In contrast to the developed states of the pre-Christian era, there is virtually no information about the Russian state, its political structure, its territories, or culture. Maybe it simply didn't exist. Of course it existed. We know from historical sources that by the time Rus was baptized, it already had cities and princedoms. And Prince Vladimir, who oversaw the baptism of Rus, was by no means its first prince. The same sources tell us about his father, Prince Sviatoslav. In other words, Rus existed contemporaneously with the Roman Empire. It had its cities and a multitude of wealthy settlements. Yes, wealthy, because the cities of ancient Rus took shape not just as capitals of princedoms, but as trade and handicraft centres serving the many settlements in the outlying area. Poor settlements do not give rise to cities. There would simply be no one to finance their construction, and no consumer demand for what they produced. And now let us try to determine whether pre-Christian Rus was a strong or a weak state. Let us suppose, for the sake of argument, that it was extremely weak. Not only that, but historians claim that Rus was divided into petty independent princedoms which were constantly warring with each other. But once again, the question arises, if pre-Christian Rus was so weak, a state torn apart by internecine conflicts, why did it not fall prey to attacks by more powerful states? As a weak state, by comparison with its neighbours, not to mention the Roman Empire, the Russian state could have been easily conquered and transformed into a tribute-paying colony. But here is where the enigma and the mysteries begin. In all the annals of the Roman Empire and other states of the period, there is no mention of any attack on Rus. We ourselves know that up to the time of the official baptism, Rus was a free and independent state, unconquered by any other. So, why did no one try to conquer pagan Rus? Perhaps it was because it had an extensive, well-organised and well-equipped army. But no, that it did not have. Even during the time of the princes, there were only small armed garrisons, whose numbers were far from equalling those of the Roman legions. We shall never understand the historical truth if we start with a false reasoning about pagan Rus, especially Vedic Rus. On the other hand, everything falls into place if we accept and understand their opposite hypotheses. Vedic Rus, before the time of the princes, was a highly spiritual, highly organised civilization. It was that same lost civilization on the earth about which legends would be subsequently told. I deliberately referred to ancient Rus not as a state but as a civilization, since the benchmark of statehood for that period is considered to be Egypt or Rome. These were under the control of supreme rulers, priests, and an elite that had enriched itself at the expense of slaves. The social structure of Rus was significantly perfected and more civilized in comparison to Egypt or Rome. In Rus at that time there was absolutely no slavery. Neither were there any petty princedoms warring among themselves. Rus was comprised of marvellous king's domains. Decisions were taken at popular assemblies known as Vish. Information was circulated by wise men. But note how the concepts have been distorted, including the meaning of the word civilization. Egypt, where all the people were subject to the rule of the priests and pharaohs, was known as a highly developed, civilized state, while Rus at the same period was called backward, uncivilized and weak, without any kind of real statehood. That's pretty steep. If there was no slavery and no petty tyrant despots, does that mean there was no state? That Rus was uncivilized? Again, the same question. Why then did nobody conquer Rus? There were, of course, attempts at conquering the Vedrus people, but those who tried it always endeavoured to erase the results of such attempts, even from their own memory. Here is what Anastasia told me about one of these attempts that took place more than 2,000 years ago. End of chapter 20.